Hello friends, and welcome to tonight's edition of Bedtime Stories for Grown-Ups. Tonight I shall be reading for you two seasonal winter stories by Lucy Maud Montgomery. If you enjoy these readings, I would encourage you to subscribe so you will be notified when a new bedtime story is ready for you. And now it is time to unwind. Settle into a place where you can relax. Once you have made yourself comfortable, take a deep breath. Your day is done. Nothing else needs to be done today, but listen to these stories, fall asleep, and get some rest. So, let's begin. The Joseph's Christmas. The month before Christmas was always the most exciting and mysterious time in the Joseph household. Such scheming and planning, such putting of curly heads together in corners, such counting of small hoards, such hiding and smuggling of things out of sight, as went on among the little Josephs. There were a good many of them, and very few of the pennies. Hence the reason for so much contriving and consulting. From 14-year-old Molly down to 4-year-old Lenny, there were 8 small Josephs in all, in the little log house on the prairie. So that when each little Joseph wanted to give a Christmas box to each of the other little Josephs, and something to Father and Mother Joseph besides, it is no wonder that they had to cudgel their small brains for ways and means thereof. Father and Mother were always discreetly blind and silent through December. No questions were asked, no matter what queer things were done. Many secret trips to the little store at the railway station 2 miles away were ignored, and no little Joseph was called to account because he or she looked terribly guilty when somebody suddenly came into the room. The air was simply charged with secrets. Sister Molly was the grand repository of these. All the little Josephs came to her for advice and assistance. It was Molly who, for troubled small brothers and sisters, did such sums and divisions as this. How can I get a 10-cent present for Emily and a 15-cent one for Jimmy out of 18 cents? Or how can 7 sticks of candy be divided among 8 people so that each shall have 1? It was Molly who advised regarding the purchase of ribbon and crepe paper. It was Molly who put the finishing touches to most of the little gifts. In short, all through December, Molly was weighed down under an avalanche of responsibility. It speaks volumes for her sagacity and skill that she never got things mixed up or made any such terrible mistake as letting one little Joseph find out what another was going to give him. That secrecy was the keystone of all plans and confidences. During this particular December, the planning and contriving had been more difficult, and the results less satisfactory than usual. The Josephs were poor at any time, but this winter they were poorer than ever. The crops had failed in the summer, and as a consequence the family were, as Jimmy said, on short commons. But they made the brave best of their small resources. And on Christmas Eve, every little Joseph went to bed with a clear conscience. For was there not on the corner table in the kitchen a small mountain of tiny, sometimes very tiny, gifts labeled with the names of recipients and givers, and worth the weight in gold, if love and good wishes count for anything? It was beginning to snow when the small Josephs went to bed, and when the big small Josephs climbed the stairs, it was snowing thickly. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph sat before the fire and listened to the wind howling about the house. "I'm glad I'm not driving over the prairie tonight," said Mr. Joseph. "It's quite a storm. I hope it will be fine tomorrow, for the children's sake. They've set their hearts on having a sleigh ride, and it will be too bad if they can't have it, when it's about all the Christmas they'll have this year. Mary, this is the first Christmas since we came west that we couldn't afford some little extras for them, even if 'twas only a box of nuts and candy." Mrs. Joseph sighed over Jimmy's worn jacket, which she was mending. Then she smiled. "Never mind, John. Things will be better next Christmas, we'll hope. The children will not mind, bless their hearts. Look at all the little knickknacks they've made for each other. Last week, when I was over at Taunton, Mr. Fisher had his store all gayified up, as Jimmy says, with Christmas presents. I did feel that I'd ask nothing better than to go in and buy all the lovely things I wanted, just for once, and give them to the children tomorrow morning. They've never had anything really nice for Christmas, but there. We've all got each other and good health and spirits. And a Christmas wouldn't be much without those if we had all the presents in the world." Mr. Joseph nodded. "That's so. I don't want to grumble, but I tell you, I did want to get Maggie a real-life doll, as she calls it. She never has had anything but homemade dolls, and that small heart of hers is set on a real one. There was one at Fisher's store today, a big beauty with real hair, and eyes that opened and shut. Just fancy Maggie's face if she saw such a Christmas box as that tomorrow morning." "Don't let's fancy it," laughed Mrs. Joseph. "It is only aggravating. Talking of candy reminds me that I made a big plateful of taffy for the children today. It's all the Christmassy I could give them. I'll get it out and put it on the table along with the children's presents." "That can't be someone at the door." "It is, though," said Mr. Joseph, as he strode to the door and flung it open. Two snowed-up figures were standing on the porch. As they stepped in, the Josephs recognized one of them as Mr. Ralston, a wealthy merchant in a small town 15 miles away. "Late hours for callers, isn't it?" said Mr. Ralston. "The fact is, our horse has about given out, and the storm is so bad that we can't proceed. This is my wife, and we are on our way to spend Christmas with my brother's family at Lindsay. Can you take us in for a night, Mr. Joseph?" "Certainly, and welcome," exclaimed Mr. Joseph heartily. "If you don't mind a shakedown by the kitchen fire for the night." "My, Mrs. Ralston," as his wife helped her off with her things, "but you are snowed up. I'll see to putting your horse away, Mr. Ralston. This way, if you please." When the two men came stamping into the house again, Mrs. Ralston and Mrs. Joseph were sitting at the fire, the former with a steaming hot cup of tea in her hand. Mr. Ralston put a big basket he was carrying down on a bench in the corner. "Thought I'd better bring our Christmas flummery in," he said. "You see, Mrs. Joseph, my brother has a big family, so we are taking them a lot of Santa Claus stuff." Mrs. Ralston packed this basket, and goodness knows what she put in it, but she half cleaned out my store. The eyes of the Lindsay youngsters will dance tomorrow, that is, if we ever get there. Mrs. Joseph gave a little sigh in spite of herself, and looked wistfully at the heap of gifts on the corner table. How meagre and small they did look, to be sure, beside that bulgy basket with its cover suggestively tied down. Mrs. Ralston looked too. "Santa Claus seems to have visited you already," she said with a smile. The Josephs laughed. "Our Santa Claus is somewhat out of pocket this year," said Mr. Joseph frankly. Those are the little things the small folks here have made for each other. They've been a month at it. And I'm always kind of relieved when Christmas is over and there are no more mysterious doings. We're in such cramped quarters here that you can't move without stepping on somebody's secret. A shakedown was spread in the kitchen for the unexpected guests, and presently the Ralstons found themselves alone. Mrs. Ralston went over to the Christmas table and looked at the little gifts half tenderly and half pityingly. "They're not much like the contents of our basket, are they?" she said, as she touched the calendar Jimmy had made for Molly out of cardboard and autumn leaves and grasses. "Just what I was thinking," returned her husband. "And I was thinking of something else too. I've a notion that I'd like to see some of the things in our basket right here on this table." "I'd like to see them all," said Mrs. Ralston promptly. "Let's just leave them here, Edward. Roger's family will have plenty of presents without them. And for that matter, we can send them ours when we go back home." "Just as you say," agreed Mr. Ralston. "I like the idea of giving the small folk of this household a rousing good Christmas for once. They're poor, I know, and I dare say pretty well pinched this year like most of the farmers hereabout after the crop failure." Mrs. Ralston untied the cover of the big basket. Then the two of them, moving as stealthily as if engaged in a burglary, transferred the contents to the table. Mr. Ralston got out a small pencil and a notebook, and by dint of comparing the names attached to the gifts on the table, they managed to divide theirs up pretty evenly among the little Josephs. When all was done, Mrs. Ralston said, "Now, I'm going to spread that tablecloth carelessly over the table. We will be going before daylight, probably, and in the hurry of getting off, I hope that Mr. and Mrs. Joseph will not notice the difference till we are gone." It fell out as Mrs. Ralston had planned. The dawn broke fine and clear over a vast white world. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph were early astir. Breakfast for the storm-stayed travelers was cooked and eaten by lamplight. Then the horse and sleigh were brought to the door, and Mr. Ralston carried out his empty basket. "I expect the trail will be heavy," he said, "but I guess we'd get to Lindsay in time for dinner anyway. Much obliged for your kindness, Mr. Joseph. When you and Mrs. Joseph come to town, we shall hope to have a chance to return it. Goodbye, and a Merry Christmas to you all." When Mrs. Joseph went back to the kitchen, her eyes fell on the heaped-up table in the corner. "Why?" she said, and snatched off the cover. One look she gave, and then this funny little mother began to cry. But they were happy tears. Mr. Joseph came too, and looked and whistled. There really seemed to be everything on that table that the hearts of the children could desire. 3 pairs of skates, a fur cap and collar, a dainty work basket, half a dozen gleaming new books, a writing desk, a roll of stuff that looked like a new dress, a pair of fur-topped kid gloves just Molly's size, and a china cup and saucer. All these were to be seen at the first glance, and in one corner of the table was a big box filled with candies and nuts and raisins, and in the other a doll with curling golden hair and brown eyes, dressed in real clothes, and with all her wardrobe in a trunk beside her. Pinned to her dress was a leaf from Mr. Ralston's notebook, with Maggie's name written on it. "Well, this is Christmas with a vengeance," said Mr. Joseph. "The children will go wild with delight," said his wife happily. They pretty nearly did when they all came scrambling down the stairs a little later. Such a Christmas had never been known in the Joseph household before. Maggie clasped the doll with shining eyes. Molly looked at the work basket that her housewifely little heart had always longed for. Studious Jimmy beamed over the books, and Ted and Hal whooped with delight over the skates. And as for the big box of good things, why, everybody appreciated that. That Christmas was one to date from in that family. I'm glad to be able to say, too, that even in the heyday of the delight and surprise over their wonderful presents, the little Josephs did not forget to appreciate the gifts they had prepared for each other. Molly thought a calendar was just too pretty for anything, and Jimmy was sure the new red mittens which Maggie had knitted for him with her own chubby wee fingers were the very nicest, gayest mittens a boy had ever worn. Mrs. Joseph's taffy was eaten too. Not a scrap of it was left. As Ted said loyally, it was just as good as the candy in the box, and had more chew to it besides. The Falsoms' Christmas Dinner. Well, so it's all settled, said Stephen Falsom. Yes, assented Alexina. Yes, it is, she repeated, as if somebody had questioned it. Then Alexina sighed. Whatever it was, the fact of its being settled did not seem to bring Alexina any great peace of mind. Nor Stephen either, judging from his face, which wore a sort of suffer and be strong expression just then. When do you go? Said Alexina, after a pause, during which she had frowned out of the window and across the Tracy yard. Josephine Tracy and her brother Duncan were strolling about the yard in the pleasant December sunshine, arm in arm, laughing and talking. They appeared to be a nice, harmless pair of people, but the sight of them did not seem to please Alexina. Just as soon as we can sell the furniture and move away, said Stephen moodily. Hey-ho, so this is what all of our fine ambitions have come to, Lexi. Your music and my MD. A place in a department store for you, and one in a lumber mill for me. I don't dare to complain, said Alexina slowly. We ought to be so thankful to get the positions. I am thankful, and I don't mind so very much about my music. But I do wish you could have gone to college, Stephen. Never mind me, said Stephen, brightening up determinedly. I'm going to go into the lumber business enthusiastically. You don't know what unsuspected talents I may develop along that line. The worst of it is that we can't be together, but I'll keep my eyes open, and perhaps I'll find a place for you in Lessing. Alexina said nothing. Her separation from Stephen was the one point in their fortunes she could not bear to discuss. There were times when Alexina did not see how she was going to exist without Stephen, but she never said so to him. She thought he had enough to worry him without her making matters worse. Well, said Stephen, getting up, I'll run down to the office. And see here, Lexi, day after tomorrow is Christmas. Are we going to celebrate it at all? If so, I'd better order the turkey. Alexina looked thoughtful. I don't know, Stephen. We're short of money, you know, and the fund is dwindling every day. Don't you think it's a little extravagant to have a turkey for 2 people? And somehow I don't feel a bit Christmassy. I think I'd rather spend it just like any other day and try to forget that it is Christmas. Everything would be so different. That's true, Lexi, and we must look after the Bobbies closely, I'll admit. When Stephen had gone out, Alexina cried a little, not very much, because she didn't want her eyes to be red against Stephen's return. But she had to cry a little. As she had said, everything was so different from what it had been a year ago. Their father had been alive then, and they had been very cozy and happy in the little house at the end of the street. There had been no mother there since Alexina's birth 16 years ago. Alexina had kept house for her father and Stephen since she was 10. Stephen was a clever boy and intended to study medicine. Alexina had a good voice, and something was to be done about training it. The Tracys lived next door to them. Duncan Tracy was Stephen's particular chum, and Josephine Tracy was Alexina's dearest friend. Alexina was never lonely when Josie was nearby to laugh and chat and plan with. Then, all at once, troubles came. In June, the firm of which Mr. Falsom was a member failed. There was some stigma attached to the failure, too, although the blame did not rest upon Mr. Falsom, but his partner. Worry and anxiety aggravated the heart trouble from which he had suffered for some time, and a month later he died. Alexina and Stephen were left alone to face the knowledge that they were penniless, and must look about for some way of supporting themselves. At first, they had hoped to be able to get something to do in Thorndale, so that they might keep their home. This proved impossible. After much discouragement and disappointment, Stephen had secured a position in the lumber mill at Lessing, and Alexina was promised a place in a department store in the city. To make matters worse, Duncan Tracy and Stephen had quarreled in October. It was only a boyish disagreement over some trifle, but bitter words had passed. Duncan, who was a quick-tempered lad, had twitted Stephen with his father's failure, and Stephen had resented it hotly. Duncan was sorry for and ashamed of his words as soon as they were uttered, but he would not humble himself to say so. Alexina had taken Stephen's part, and her manner to Josie assumed a tinge of coldness. Josie quickly noticed and resented it, and the breach between the two girls widened almost insensibly, until they barely spoke when they met. Each blamed the other and cherished bitterness in the heart. When Stephen came home from the post office, he looked excited. "Were there any letters?" asked Alexina. "Well, rather. One from Uncle James." "Uncle James?" exclaimed Alexina incredulously. "Yes, beloved sis. Oh, you needn't try to look as surprised as I did. And I ordered the turkey after all. Uncle James has invited himself here to dinner on Christmas Day. You'll have a chance to show your culinary skill, for you know, we've always been told that Uncle James was a gourmand." Alexina read the letter in amaze. It was a brief epistle stating that the writer wished to make the acquaintance of his niece and nephew, and would visit them on Christmas Day. That was all. But Alexina instantly saw a future of rosy possibilities. For Uncle James, who lived in the city and was really a great uncle, had never taken the slightest notice of their family since his quarrel with their father 20 years ago. But this looked as if Uncle James were disposed to hold out the olive branch. "Oh, Stephen, if he likes you, and if he offers to educate you," breathed Alexina. "Perhaps he will, if he is favorably impressed. But we'll have to be so careful. He is so whimsical and odd. At least, everybody has always said so. A little thing may turn the scale either way. Anyway, we must have a good dinner for him. I'll have plum pudding and mince pie." For the next 36 hours, Alexina lived in a whirl. There was so much to do. The little house was put in apple pie order from top to bottom, and Stephen was set to stoning raisins and chopping meat and beating eggs. Alexina was perfectly reckless. no matter how big a hole it made in their finances. Uncle James must have a proper Christmas dinner. A favorable impression must be made. Stephen's whole future, Alexina did not think about her own at all just then, might depend on it. Christmas morning came, fine and bright and warm. It was more like a morning in early spring than in December, for there was no snow or frost, and the air was moist and balmy. Alexina was up at daybreak, cleaning and decorating at a furious rate. By 11 o'clock, everything was finished or going forward briskly. The plum pudding was bubbling in the pot. The turkey, Burton's plummest, was sizzling in the oven. The shelf in the pantry bore 2 mince pies, upon which Alexina was willing to stake a culinary reputation. And Stephen had gone to the train to meet Uncle James. From her kitchen window, Alexina could see brisk preparations going on in the Tracy kitchen. She knew Josie and Duncan were all alone. Their parents had gone to spend Christmas with friends in Lessing. In spite of her hurry and excitement, Alexina found time to sigh. Last Christmas, Josie and Duncan had come over and eaten the dinner with them. But now, last Christmas seemed very far away, and Josie had behaved horridly. Alexina was quite clear on that point. Then Stephen came with Uncle James. Uncle James was a rather pompous, fussy old man with red cheeks and bushy eyebrows. Smells nice in here," was his salutation to Alexina. "I hope it will taste as good as it smells. I'm hungry." Alexina soon left Uncle James and Stephen talking in the parlor and betook herself anxiously to the kitchen. She set the table in the little dining room, now and then pausing to listen with a delighted nod to the murmur of voices and laughter in the parlor. She felt sure that Stephen was making a favorable impression. She lifted the plum pudding and put it on a plate on the kitchen table. Then she took out the turkey, beautifully done, and put it on a platter. Finally, she popped the 2 mince pies into the oven. Just at this moment, Stephen stuck his head in at the hall door. "Lexi, do you know where that letter of Governor Howland's to Father is? Uncle James wants to see it." Alexina, not waiting to shut the oven door, for delay might impress Uncle James unfavorably, rushed upstairs to get the letter. She was 10 minutes finding it. Then, remembering her pies, she flew back to the kitchen. In the middle of the floor, she stopped as if transfixed, staring at the table. The turkey was gone, and the plum pudding was gone, and the mince pies were gone. Nothing was left but the platters. For a moment, Alexina refused to believe her eyes. Then she saw a trail of greasy drops on the floor to the open door, and out over the doorstep, and along the boards of the walk to the back fence. Alexina did not make a fuss. Even at that horrible moment she remembered the importance of making a favorable impression. But she could not quite keep the alarm and excitement out of her voice as she called Stephen. And Stephen knew that something had gone wrong as he came quickly through the hall. "Is the turkey burnt, Lexi?" he cried. "Burnt? No, it's 10 times worse," gasped Alexina. "It's gone, Stephen. And the pudding and the minced pies too. Oh, what shall we do? Who can have taken them?" It may be stated right here and now that the Falsoms never really knew anything more about the disappearance of the Christmas dinner than they did at that moment. But the only reasonable explanation of the mystery was that a tramp had entered the kitchen and made off with the good things. The Falsom house was right at the end of the street. The narrow backyard opened on a lonely road. Across the road was a stretch of pine woods, There was no house very near except the Tracy one. Stephen reached this conclusion with a bound. He ran out to the yard gate, followed by the distracted Alexina. The only person visible was a man some distance down the road. Stephen leapt over the gate and tore down the road in pursuit of him. Alexina went back to the doorstep, sat down upon it, and began to cry. She couldn't help it. Her hopes were all in ruins around here. There was no dinner for Uncle James. Joseph and Tracy saw her crying. Now, Josie honestly thought that she had a grievance against Alexina. But an Alexina walking unconcernedly by with a cool nod and her head held high was a very different person from an Alexina sitting on a back doorstep on Christmas morning crying. For a moment Josie hesitated. Then she slowly went out and across the yard to the fence. "What is the trouble?" she asked. Alexina forgot that there was such a thing as dignity to be kept up. Or, if she remembered it, she was past caring for such a trifle. "Our dinner is gone," she sobbed, "and there is nothing to give Uncle James to eat except vegetables. And I do so want to make a favorable impression." This was not particularly lucid, but Josie, with a flying mental leap, arrived at the conclusion that it was very important that Uncle James, whoever he was, should have a dinner, and she knew where one was to be had. But before she could speak, Stephen returned, looking rueful. "No use, Lexi. That man was only old Mr. Byers, and he had seen no sign of a tramp. There's a trail of grease right around the road. The tramp must have taken directly to the woods. We'll simply have to do without our Christmas dinner." "By no means," said Josie quickly, with a little red spot on either cheek. "Our dinner is all ready, turkey, pudding and all. Let us lend it to you. Don't say a word to your uncle about the accident." Alexina flushed and hesitated. "It's very kind of you," she stammered, "but I'm afraid it would be too much." "Not a bit of it," Josie interrupted warmly. "Didn't Duncan and I have Christmas dinner at your house last year? Just come and help us carry it over. If you lend us your dinner, you and Duncan must come and help us eat it," said Alexina resolutely. "I'll come, of course," said Josie, "and I think that Duncan will too. If... She looked at Stephen, the scarlet spots deepening. Stephen colored too. "Duncan must come," he said quietly. "I'll go and ask him." 2 minutes later, a peculiar procession marched out of the Tracy kitchen door, across the 2 yards, and into the Falsom house. Josie headed it, carrying a turkey on a platter. Alexina came next with a plum pudding. Stephen and Duncan followed with a hot mince pie apiece. And in a few more minutes, Alexina gravely announced to Uncle James that dinner was ready. The dinner was a pronounced success, marked by much suppressed hilarity among the younger members of the party. Uncle James ate very heartily and seemed to enjoy everything, especially the mince pie. "This is the best mince pie I have ever sampled," he told Alexina. "I'm glad to know that I have a niece who can make such a mince pie." Alexina cast an agonized look at Josie and was on the point of explaining that she wasn't the maker of the pie, but Josie frowned her into silence. "I felt so guilty to sit there and take the credit, your credit," she told Josie afterwards, as they washed up the dishes. "Nonsense," said Josie. "It wasn't as if you couldn't make mince pies. Your mince pies are better than mine, if it comes to that. It might have spoiled everything if you'd said a word. I must go home now. Won't you and Stephen come over after your uncle goes and spend the evening with us? We'll have a candy pull." When Josie and Duncan had gone, Uncle James called his nephew and niece into the parlor and sat down before them with approving eyes. "I want to have a little talk with you too. I'm sorry I've let so many years go by without making your acquaintance, because you seem worth getting acquainted with. Now, what are your plans for the future?" "I'm going into the lumber mill at Lessing, and Alexina is going into the T. Morson store," said Stephen quietly. "Tut, tut, no, you're not. And she's not. You're coming to live with me, both of you. If you have a fancy for cutting and carving people up, young man, you must be trained to cut and carve them scientifically anyhow. As for you, Alexina, Stephen tells me you can sing. Well, there's a good conservatory of music in town. Wouldn't you rather go there instead of behind a counter?" "Oh, Uncle James!" exclaimed Alexina with shining eyes. She jumped up, put her arms about Uncle James's neck, and kissed him. Uncle James said, "Tut, tut," again, but he liked it. When Stephen had seen his uncle off on the 6 o'clock train, he returned home and looked at the radiant Alexina. "Well, you made your favorable impression all right, didn't you?" he said gaily. "But we owe it to Josie Tracy. Isn't she a brick? I suppose you're going over this evening?" "Yes, I am. I am so tired that I feel as if I couldn't crawl across the yard. But if I can't, you'll have to carry me. Go I will. I can't begin to tell you how glad I am about everything. But really, the fact that you and Duncan and Josie and I are good friends again seems the best of all. I'm glad that tramp stole the dinner, and I hope he enjoyed it. I don't grudge him one single bite."